BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be revisiting Walter Sickert as a Jack the Ripper suspect, looking at the book Jack the Ripper, The Code Was on the Wall, and continuing with the discussions and comments from the Ripper cast. Can you guys know the drill? You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. Walter Sickert is one of the most famous Jack the Ripper suspects, and he is a different type of suspect because he has been incorporated into several different theories, and as we're going to see very clearly in this episode, there are multiple books that have been written about him. I just mentioned the Ripper cast, and they had a guest once who was a tour guide in London giving the Jack the Ripper tours, and he said that when he has American guests, they instantly ask about Patricia Cornwell and her books accusing Walter Sickert of being Jack the Ripper, and I have a standalone episode on her book, Portrait of a Killer, available here on BBOR. And if he has British guests on the tour, they talk about Stephen Knight and The Final Solution. And what are the commonalities among the Patricia Cornwell books and Stephen Knight's The Final Solution? They both are theories that involve Walter Sickert, and we're going to see that it's not going to end there. Firstly, this is not the first episode that I've done about Walter Sickert. I do have a more general standalone episode about him as a Jack the Ripper suspect in the playlist, but I wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about some of the other books and theories that have been shared that involve Walter Sickert as a Jack the Ripper suspect. For example, let's just provide the most basic introduction. Walter Sickert was born on May 31st of 1860, and he passed away on January 22nd of 1942. Born May 31st of 1860. That means that he would have been 28 years old at the time when Jack the Ripper committed the Autumn of Terror murders in 1888. 28 is not unreasonable for a Jack the Ripper suspect. That's entirely possible. And, I mean, a lot of people estimate that Jack the Ripper could have been in his late 20s, early 30s, or even around age 30, and Walter Sickert would meet all of that. Some of the reasons why people believe that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper is because he is more famous for being an artist rather than being a Ripper suspect. I mean, he is a very accomplished artist. He's a world-renowned artist. And even on his own Wikipedia page it states, Walter Sickert took a keen interest in the crimes of Jack the Ripper and believed that he had lodged in a room used by the notorious serial killer. He had been told this by his landlady, who suspected the previous lodger who stayed there in 1881. Sickert did a painting called Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. It shows a dark, melancholy room with most details obscured. Although for over 80 years there was no mention of Sickert being a suspect in the Ripper crimes, some authors have explored the idea that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper or his accomplice. Sickert is not considered a serious suspect by most who study the case, and strong evidence shows that he spent most of the time outside of the UK and was in France. So do we just close the door right there? Is he a type of suspect that has to be dismissed? Well, some people very clearly do not think so. And one of them is named Paul Christian. And earlier this year on the channel, I found the Paul Christian books online, and I did a book discussion on one of his 4 Jack the Ripper books. It's actually called Zodiac the Ripper, but I discussed it for Ripper Wednesday. And I loved that book because he talks about a creative way of trying to solve the Zodiac killer mystery. And, I have an episode on Ripper Wednesday about that if you want to hear it in its entirety. But he talks about how about the influences from Jack the Ripper on the Zodiac killer, and maybe one way we could solve the Zodiac mystery is who was reading books about Jack the Ripper in San Francisco in the 1960s, library records, also things like catalog purchases, and how were the Jack the Ripper materials distributed in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I love outside the box thinking. It's not a perfect book, and I go into all of the reasons why in my book discussion, but he has 3 other books out there, and one of the things that I saw on Paul Christian's website was that he not only stated that he had a Jack the Ripper suspect, but he stated that he had solved the Jack the Ripper mystery, and Jack the Ripper was none other than Walter Sickert. And you can actually even see that on a website called Hemel Today. And this says, this is shared by the newsroom that says, author solves Jack the Ripper, the 130-year-old mystery. Paul Christian, author of The Inevitable Jack the Ripper, says the 130-year-old painting contains clues to suggest that the notorious serial killer was Walter Sickert. Mr. Christian was first sent Walter Sickert's painting, which shows the London scene featuring what is believed to be 2 of Jack the Ripper's victims, Mary Jane Kelly and Martha Tabram. He first viewed this in 2013, and he said, "The evidence I have unearthed can allow us to confidently point the finger at Walter Sickert and an art world conspiracy behind the Jack the Ripper case. The painting shows a number of important clues, including the metal railing, which spells out the year 1888, and a woman with a bloodied shawl visible from the balcony, matching the description of Mary Kelly." And I was like, well, okay, I mean, we will really have to have a closer inspection of this. But it says, the reverse of the pictures include intriguing and eerie doodles, which appear to show some kind of inquisition. Jack the Ripper is infamous for the 1888 murders of what is believed to be 5 prostitutes in London. Paul Christian, who was 36 years old at the time of this article, says, this book draws on many of Hertfordshire's solid links to the Jack the Ripper mystery, including the suggestion that the then Prime Minister and forebearer of the current Lord Salisbury may have had secrets pertaining to the identity of the killer. This book also looks at red herrings in Rickmansworth and a solid Ripper suspect's death. The Inevitable Jack the Ripper is Mr. Christian's first book, one he relished writing on his journey to uncover the solution to the famous mystery. He said that it was good fun to write, but there were a lot of long train journeys typing the story on my phone. This book represents the culmination of a journey that officially began 5 years ago, but in actual, my relationship with this terrible case goes back much further. And the book that he's talking about is The Inevitable Jack the Ripper. And he also has the Jack the Ripper picture book, Zodiac the Ripper that I mentioned, and he has another book out there called Jack the Ripper's County, which I'll talk about in just a second. But with this painting that is in question, okay, the painting shows someone holding a shawl hanging over a railing. It's apparently depicting the 2 victims, Martha Tabram and Mary Kelly. Well, I mean, to be honest, when we look at this exact painting, yes, of course, there is somebody holding what appears to be a red shawl, but I can't really make out any discernible features. Really, these could be any 2 women. It looks like a very, very vague and general presentation on, I mean, there's not a whole lot of depth to that, and people can also see what they want to see when they're looking at these types of paintings, and this really turns into the entire foundation of the Walter Sickert theory in the 21st century. Of course, Stephen Knight's book, The Final Solution, came out in the mid-20th century, but in the 21st century, we're looking at a lot of people who are analyzing Walter Sickert's paintings and his artwork, and they're talking about how there must be clues that indicate that he was Jack the Ripper. And I went over to visit the pub test to see Owen's channel and to see what he had to say about Walter Sickert, and of course he has a video about him. And if you haven't subscribed to the pub test yet, that's a great channel for suspect profile videos and discussions on Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders. And more or less, I think those were my big takeaways from Owen's presentation. The first is that he was saying that a claim that was made about Walter Sickert was that he only made paintings of things that he either saw with his own eyes or a photograph that he had witnessed. He didn't paint things purely from his imagination. And not only did he do the painting Jack the Ripper's bedroom, but he also did paintings of Mary Kelly and Catherine Eddowes, the two victims of Jack the Ripper, the fourth and fifth victims respectively. So how could that be? Does that not suggest that he saw Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly? Well, in Owen's video, he talked about an alternative theory that in 1897 a book was published in France that featured the photos of Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly, and talking about the crime scenes and their murders. So it's quite possible that Walter Sickert read that book and then made his artwork based on looking at those photos, because he didn't do paintings of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, or Liz Stride. Although Paul Christian claims here that he made a painting that featured Martha Tabram, who's what we call a pre-canonical victim. But if I can be honest with you, there doesn't really seem to be a whole lot of substance here. And you may notice that the woman who's supposed to be Mary Kelly is holding what's called a red shawl. And the shawl was discussed very frequently in news articles over the last 11 years. And in one of his other books, in another book that was written by Paul Christian called Jack the Ripper's County, he talks more about the shawl. But in all seriousness, the shawl is not connected to Walter Sickert. It's connected to a different suspect named Aaron Kosminski. And some of you may remember the media firestorms, plural. Every 3 to 5 years, someone is saying that they have Jack the Ripper's DNA found on the shawl, and that someone is named Russell Edwards. And in the book Jack the Ripper's County, there's a very big introduction on Russell Edwards and the shawl. And I'm just going to quote Paul Christian right here that says, Mr. Edwards' story goes to say that the officer kept a bloody shawl from the crime scene, which allegedly had both Catherine Eddowes' DNA and her killer's DNA on it. Okay, now one thing, though, that Steve Blomer really wanted to reinforce is that the media did take this story, and they have shape-shifted it. One thing that Russell Edwards stands by now is that he doesn't say that the shawl belonged to Catherine Eddowes. He actually says the shawl belonged to Aaron Kosminski because it had an East European pattern, and Kosminski was Polish from Eastern Europe. The garment allegedly kept within the family and was passed down through generations until it was bought at an auction by Mr. Russell Edwards in 2007. The shawl was described in the press release for the book's publisher as large, over 7 feet long, made of silk, and obviously very old and damaged, and a piece was missing. After the shawl was taken by the policeman, it was said that it's been a few years in the Black Museum, as well as being in the possession of Smith's family. Mr. Edwards explains in the book that the shawl had undergone years of dedicated historical and scientific research to prove, by way of alleged DNA on the shawl, that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. And, this is really going into a lot of stuff about Kosminski, and I think that this is really just something that perhaps Paul Christian is going to be disputing, because, of course, he has a different suspect named Walter Sickert. And the honest answer is, I think that both of these methods for identifying Jack the Ripper are fruitless. They are impractical. They're not very beneficial. Just to take, person X's DNA from the shawl, which we don't even know if it's Kosminski's or not. We don't even know if that belonged to Aaron Kosminski, and say that there's a mitochondrial DNA match, mitochondrial DNA that could be shared from 10,000 to 200,000 other people in England at the time. That's impractical. And also to look at paintings and say that, he left these very small signatures indicating that he was Jack the Ripper in his artwork. And I'm going to share something very big about that in a second, because I told you guys that there is another book out there, and we're finally getting to the title sequence for today's episode, Jack the Ripper, The Code Was on the Wall. And I have to give a shout out to longtime BBOR follower Batman66, who sent me this one. This is a book by Alan Downey, and this is also going to talk about Walter Sickert as being Jack the Ripper. Now, I'm going to read the description for you here. The book describes in detail how the letters that Jack the Ripper wrote to the police and others who had an interest in the murders contained a message. The message was also found on the chalk writing on the wall, the enigmatic, "Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This, of course, is referring to the Goulston Street graffito After the murder of Catherine Eddowes on September 30th of 1888, at some time in the early AM hours, a message was noticed that was found on a building in Goulston Street on the door jamb that said something to the effect of, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." We don't know the exact text, we don't know the exact phrasing, but that's more or less what it said. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. This was found soon after the murder of Catherine Eddowes. This one says Eddowes instead of Eddowes in the description. Just below the writing, lying on the ground, was a piece of Catherine's apron, still wet with blood. This was the murderer's way of showing that he had written the words above the apron. Well, I mean, that is something that I entertain. I think that that's entirely possible. And one of the biggest reversals that I've had about the Jack the Ripper case is, I used to think that it was just completely unrelated, that the Goulston Street graffito had nothing to do with Jack the Ripper. Then I began to give it some more thought, and I was like, okay, maybe it actually is Jack the Ripper related, but I am fully willing to admit that everything that you just heard is all just conjecture, it's theoretical. It has never been purely certified that that's why the apron was dropped there, that's the meaning of it all, that the person was trying to alert people to the Goulston Street graffito so that they would read it and that they would know that they are the murderer of Catherine Eddowes. Okay, so this was found soon after, we read that. This was the murderer's way of showing that he had written the words above the apron. When the words are decoded, the message contained shows that they were written by the English Impressionist painter Walter Sickert, who was born May 31st, 1860 in Munich, Germany, and died on January 22nd, 1942 in Bath, England. And I will also just throw in something from my previous episodes. Walter Sickert was indeed born in Germany, but he was of Danish and mixed European descent, and for many years Sickert was a close friend of the writer Oscar Wilde. Now we're getting to the new theory. And until Wilde was sent to prison, when Wilde was released from prison, Sickert eschewed him. Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray was written in 1890 when they were still friends, and it confirms in a coded message that Oscar Wilde knew that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. And one more time, this book is called Jack the Ripper, The Code Was on the Wall by Alan Downey, with its lovely, sarcastic, rainbow Jack the Ripper letters. I'm not sure why he chose to do that for the book. I can take a few guesses, and it might have something to do with Oscar Wilde, but that's the way that he chose to design his book cover all the same. Now, this is going to tie in very neatly to some of our discussions about the Ripper cast. And I was listening to the episode of the Ripper cast that has been posted on YouTube, and they were interviewing a man named Stan Russo, a Ripperologist who wrote the book The Jack the Ripper Suspects. And he said something that really stood out to me, and that is that sometimes people want to be part of the discussion. So what they do is, they take a theory that cannot be disproven, they concoct their own hypothesis that cannot be disproven, and then they're like, hey, look what I did. I did something. But in all reality, that's just looking at Walter Sickert's paintings and saying, I think that resembles an 1888. Okay, therefore he was Jack the Ripper. Oh, looking at the writings of Oscar Wilde and saying, well, I'm going to pull out these words and it reveals some type of interpretive message indicating that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. And that is an impractical method as well. That is something that is just not going to get definitive answers. And people cannot disprove that. You'd be like, oh, well, I mean, that shadow on the painting does resemble a 1 and an 8. I mean, maybe that person isn't wrong. Or that these words are written in a certain way in the picture of Dorian Gray, the portrait of Walter Sickert. Okay, I mean, therefore this person was Jack the Ripper. They might have real facts, but to say that these facts are connected to the Jack the Ripper case, or that these facts actually prove that their suspect was Jack the Ripper, are just impractical. I mean, that is not how you certify that somebody was a Ripper suspect, or that this is the correct suspect and this person actually committed the Whitechapel murders. So I would really like to turn it over to you guys. I think you can tell from the way that I'm talking, I don't think that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. I really don't. When I did my suspect ratings episode, I placed him as a bottom-level suspect, talking about bottom of the barrel. highly unlikely. Because I'm very skeptical of any of these theories that are involving interpretations of paintings or pulling out certain words from somebody else's book. This isn't even from Walter Sickert's memoirs or anything. This is from Oscar Wilde's book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And he's like letting people know that he knew the identity of Jack the Ripper. All of that stuff is speculative. And it really comes back to something that we discussed when I did the episode on Lewis Carroll as the Jack the Ripper suspect. There's a book out there called Jack the Ripper, Lighthearted Friend, which was written by Richard Wallace, and that talks about how Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland and Jabberwocky, may have been Jack the Ripper. And in that book, one of the key pieces of evidence that Richard Wallace puts forward is a set of anagrams that he has created that indicates that Lewis Carroll was actually confessing to being Jack the Ripper, and if you take his letters and you rearrange the actual letters of them, then that shows that he's confessing to being Jack the Ripper. It's all done with anagramming. And the challenges that Richard Wallace faced were that, well, now wait a second, just the anagrams that you have created aren't the only possible anagrams. You can also rearrange, we're talking about like the text from a full page into other words and to other sayings and to other coherent English explanations. Sometimes there are thousands of possibilities that can be created. Sometimes there are millions of possibilities that can be created. And then people are just going to be thinking, okay, well, how did you find the right one? How did you know that that's what this person was thinking if thousands, if not millions of possibilities can be created using the same method? And I think a lot of this would apply to interpretations of somebody else's artwork. I mean, by artwork, I really meant a book, somebody else's book, like looking at the writings of Oscar Wilde and saying that he left clues, looking at Walter Sickert's painting and saying that they're confessions to being Jack the Ripper. I really am not very impressed with this, because this is not true forensic evidence. This is exactly what Stan Russo was talking about. Somebody is pulling up a theory that cannot be convincingly disproven. Like with Richard Wallace and his anagrams, he can be like, no, I can demonstrate you. These anagrams check out. Okay, maybe they check out, but how do you know that that's what the killer was thinking? Maybe somebody found these images in the painting. Well, how do you know that that's what Walter Sickert was thinking when he wrote it, unless he told you? And also, for the writings of Oscar Wilde, how do you know that he was secretly confessing that he knew the identity of Jack the Ripper, unless he specifically stated that? So these types of interpretive clues, I think, do not go very far. They don't pass the sniff test, and it ties into that whole other concept of somebody just wants to be involved in the discussion. Somebody just wants to participate in the discussions about Jack the Ripper. They want to say that they've identified the killer and they deserve the praise. Now, with somebody like Paul Christian, I mean, I do put him in a different category. I told you I read Zodiac the Ripper. I loved that book. This one here by Alan Downey, I don't necessarily think that it's worth the time. But I also told you guys that I was following along with a discussion on the Rippercast, and Stan Russo wrote the book Jack the Ripper, The Suspects. And he had a lot of things to say about a different Jack the Ripper suspect, and his name was Aaron Kosminski. And you heard the stuff about Russell Edwards and the shawl, and I really think that we should just kind of put that on the back burner. And I think it's also odd that Paul Christian chose to include those things in a book where he's ultimately going to claim that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. Or let's be fair. If Walter Sickert is his suspect, why he is including the story of the shawl in any of his books, I mean, I think it would be a better use of his time to try and make the case that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper, as opposed to spending any time on Russell Edwards at all. For somebody like me who doesn't have a suspect, let's do it till the cows come home. And I really think, though, that, it was just music to my ears when I heard somebody like Steve Blomer say something to the effect of that Aaron Kosminski is a strong suspect, but I don't think the shawl is reliable at all. And that's really where I stand on this. Like, Aaron Kosminski could have been Jack the Ripper. Walter Sickert, almost certainly not. But Aaron Kosminski could have been the real person who committed these murders. Yet Russell Edwards and his table runner do not help the candidacy for Kosminski. If anything, actually hurt the candidacy for Kosminski. But one of the strikes against Aaron Kosminski put forward by Stan Russo is that he was an imbecile. He was an imbecile, and I'm not talking about the whole thing about he's the type of guy who would like to eat food out of the gutter. No, just saying that he was a really dumb person. Therefore, he couldn't have been Jack the Ripper. And when he uses the word imbecile, maybe he means something to the effect of he was mentally incompetent, he was somebody who didn't have the strongest awareness of his mental faculties. Well, firstly, I'm not even convinced of those things about Kosminski, not in 1888, in 1891, but moreover, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't necessarily think that Jack the Ripper was that intelligent. I have not seen anything from the Ripper's crimes that indicate that he was intelligent, that he was someone of above average intelligence. I mean, even though he's cutting out organs from the victims, that could have been done in somewhat of an uncalculated way. And who's the loudest voice on that? Patricia Cornwell, who has Walter Sickert as a suspect. She's like, you don't have to be a medical doctor to do this. You could just be stabbing downward and grabbing a hold of whatever you could and running away. All right, well, maybe her suspect, Walter Sickert, is a little bit too unnecessarily intelligent to have been Jack the Ripper. Let's be clear, I'm not opposed to anything. The thing that I want to be very clear is that I don't think an enormous amount of intelligence was necessary to commit the Whitechapel murders. Almost any of them. And give me your feedback on that. Challenge me on that. Tell me what you think in the comments section down below. That doesn't mean that Jack the Ripper couldn't have been a doctor. It doesn't mean he couldn't have been an artist like Sickert. It just means that I don't think he had to be that smart. So you're going to say somebody like Kosminski is disqualified because he was an imbecile, because he wasn't smart. I don't accept that at all. There is no real, intellectual thought that was put in to the murders. He's attacking women in vulnerable places, stabbing them, and it could be exactly what Patricia Cornwell says, pulling out the organs when it was convenient for him, quickly and swiftly, and getting away. One thing I do notice about Jack the Ripper is he does seem to be extremely aware of his surroundings. Like, maybe he wasn't experiencing psychotic episodes. That would actually be a strike against Kosminski, because Kosminski was a schizophrenic. Although we don't know his mental state at the time in 1888, it's not like a psychiatrist was giving minute-by-minute reports on his actions and activities. But, I mean, when it comes to somebody like Walter Sickert, I just think that he's been unfairly blamed and unfairly vilified. I think that he is somebody who has been accused of these things because of his peculiar behavior, because of his fascination with the Ripper paintings. Just because you made a painting about Jack the Ripper does not mean that you were Jack the Ripper. And let alone, all that means is he took an interest in the Whitechapel murders. He took an interest in the Autumn of Terror. But overall, I would love to know what you guys think about Walter Sickert or Aaron Kosminski. And the final thing that I will leave you with is, I just remembered something that just hit me like a lightning bolt. When I was listening to the episode of the pub test hosted by Owen, he was talking about how there was this alleged DNA match between the Dear Boss letter and Walter Sickert, and that was something that was put forward by Patricia Cornwell. I don't recall that from when I did my episodes. I remember very clearly that it was the Openshaw letter, not the Dear Boss letter, which has a lower probability of being true, but it was my understanding that the Dear Boss letter had been stolen from the police archives, and it was anonymously returned in 1888, so there was no possible way that they could do any reliable DNA testing. That's just what I recall offhand. And I've talked about two Jack the Ripper suspects here, Aaron Kosminski and Walter Sickert. And the real motive for this episode was to go through some of the other books out there and look at these other claims that have been made. And, I mean, I talked about the Paul Christian books and this one from Alan Downey, but I want to ask you guys, do you believe that it is a practical method to identify Jack the Ripper using the interpretations of artwork and literature? Do you think people have hidden secret clues in their paintings or in their books that reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper? Or is all of that stuff just simply useless? Is that just not going to give us any answers? And the thing The sad thing that also won't give us any answers is looking at an unreliable DNA source like the Shawl, Eddowes' Shawl or Kosminski Shawl, depending on who it is. And really, I mean, just let me know what you think about any of that. I would love to read your responses. You can put your ideas in the comments section down below. And as always, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these discussions about Jack the Ripper suspects every Wednesday. You can also download this program for free on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts, under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime. And you can also get the images that you see going by on the screen. They are archived at True Crime Designs on Facebook. This show comes to you Monday through Friday, talking about Jack the Ripper on Wednesdays, on Mondays about the Zodiac Killer, on Tuesdays about the disappearance of Maura Murray, on Thursdays about the Black Dahlia, and on Fridays about D.B. Cooper. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. My Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and my YouTube name is Black Box Online Radio, and on Instagram, blackboxonlineradio. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now, and I will see you tomorrow for a new episode about the Black Dahlia. Until next time.